Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Tunisia is where the Arab Spring began. And today, 7 years on, despite some setbacks, it is the only country in the Arab world where those uprisings have given way to a peaceful transition to a functioning democracy. Now, my guest today, Safwan Masri, says that's no coincidence. In a region where the backlash against the so-called Arab Spring has often been violent and repressive, Masri, who's in charge of Columbia University's Global Research Centers, says that Tunisia's traditions of reform, moderation, and tolerance made its Jasmine Revolution uniquely qualified to succeed where others in the region failed. And in his book, his new book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, Masri reveals the special ingredients in the recipe of that success. Welcome to our studios today.
Thank you, Douglas. It's nice
Listen,
to be here.
I don't want to say them. I've read a lot of your book here, and I saw the elements in that recipe. I know the ingredients, but I want to give you the opportunity to tell our viewers what they are. I'll just give one thing away.
Sure.
You put a big emphasis, you're an educator yourself,
Yes.
on education, and not just education, but a progressive education system.
Right, and that's partially because I know the education systems of the rest of the region very well. And actually, I mean, my book addresses problems within the Arab region by looking at Tunisia as sort of an exception and looking at its example. And so my research led me to the following conclusions, and those are that there are perhaps two categories of factors that help Tunisia in its ability to transition towards democracy. Some of those are, if you will, environmental luck factors. It was really aided by its geography, its small size, its presence on the Mediterranean, close to Europe, away from the center of gravity of inter-Arab intrigue.
And can I just interrupt? Because you also note in your book that, in fact, and this surprised me, parts of Tunisia are actually further north than the southern part of Sicily in Italy.
That's right. And Tunisians are very quick to point that out to you. Tunisia also was the province of Africa in the Roman Empire, and then became Wilayat Afriqiya under the when the Arab Muslims arrived. So Tunisians also point to the fact that they loaned the entire continent the name that it now has, Africa. So anyway, I mean, so you've got those factors that aided Tunisia.
The geography, long
history, a strong sense of identity, no resource curse. So
right, you didn't have the oil there.
You didn't have the oil there.
Or the foreign interference.
Exactly. So it did not get entangled in the Cold War. It did not get entangled in other regional issues. And Bourguiba, the first president of an independent Tunisia, also made sure that Tunisia steered away from conflicts, either inter-Arab conflicts or the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Could I just jump in here? Right. Because you mentioned Bourguiba. He's considered the founding father of Tunisia in a sense, right?
Right.
It's interesting because, right, he was known as a reformist, okay?
Right.
He could be autocratic, but he was a reformist. But you note, and this is what's interesting too, that reformist tradition goes back to the 19th century.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, and actually there are reforms that happened long before then. So in the 8th century, for example, you had a tradition, you had a law, basically, that governed marriage and gave a woman protection against her husband taking on a second wife. Because, as you know, in Islam, Sharia allows for multiple wives, up to 4 wives. But it's very difficult, if not impossible, to draw a direct line between what happened in the 8th and 9th century with what's happening today. But if you go back to the beginning of the 19th century and you look at the reforms and the expansiveness of those reforms that dealt with constitutionalism, Tunisia adopted the constitution in 1861.
And then they updated it more recently.
Of course, in 1959 after independence, in 1956, and more recently in 2014. That constitution is the only Arab constitution which protects freedom of conscience. So Tunisia is the only Arab country where it is legal to be an atheist,
And this is something, once again, I just jump in because your ingredients, right? You talked about women's rights, right?
Yes.
There's always this respect or appreciation for women's rights in society, education, religious moderation,
right?
But also, and I want to get to this, civil society, right?
Civil society was very, very important.
Tell us about it, because in 2015, we remember the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet won the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's exactly right.
And who were these people?
Deservedly so. So they were led by UGTT, the Union Générale Tunisienne de Travail, which is the labor federation. But the quartet also included the organization that represents business owners' interests, the human rights organization, and the lawyers' syndicate.
All sectors of society coming together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's all rooted in labor unionism, which started in Tunisia in the 1920s. The first labor union was established in 1926. UGTT was established in 1946. And the labor union movement became inseparable from the nationalist movement for independence.
It's almost as if the labor union movement was almost like the military in Egypt.
That's
the
exactly
same
right. So
role.
What you have in Egypt, a very strong and hegemonic military. By contrast, you have a very small apolitical military in Tunisia. When it comes to civil society also, in Egypt, by the way, labor unionism started around the same time as it did in Tunisia.
Right.
But Jamal Abdel Nasser brought it under his control in 1957. And in the years leading to the revolution in Egypt, on every occasion, the the Federation for Labor Workers stood with the regime against the workers. So yes, you have the flip.
Safwan, it comes to the moment where I have to now be devil's advocate. I'm going to turn it around on you. I want to believe in your book. I want to believe in your thesis here. But listen, you know as well as I, earlier this year we saw economic protests erupting against several towns in Tunisia, right, against rising taxes and prices for gasoline, for phone cards, for even fruits and vegetables. What makes you think these social crises are still there, the economic poverty, the high unemployment? Do you think Tunisia is armored against that? Could we see a second Arab Spring there?
So I don't know. I mean, so let me just say from the outset, I am incredibly optimistic and hopeful, but I cannot guarantee, of course,
you can't guarantee
we're not looking into a crystal ball. I do argue, though, that the ingredients that have been in the making for a very long time in Tunisia do provide for an environment that is able to withstand the pressures. By the way, the pressures that Tunisia is subjected to today are not new. In 1864, you had a revolution in the interior of the country. In 1983 and 1984, you had the bread riots. Many of the problems that Tunisia has been facing over the past 3 decades, we glossed over in the 1990s and the 2000s under Ben Ali because we ignored the differences between economic prosperity in the coastal region
in the north,
exactly, and the marginalization in the interior of the country. I'm not trying to diminish those problems, but what I'm saying is,
you think people can talk, they can have a dialogue in Tunisia where they might not be able to do that in, say, Yemen or Syria or Egypt or Libya?
There's a culture of debate, which again, I argue is deeply rooted in the education system of Tunisia, and not only in the education system of the independent Tunisia, but the intellectual reform movement that started in the 19th century and established secular educational institutions. And what was really interesting about
secular, with the emphasis being on secular.
On secular, but those were also parallel to Zaytuna Mosque, which was a great place of knowledge and scholarship. Reforms took place within Zaytuna as they were taking place outside of Zaytuna, and the two interacted and talked with one another. And so what you didn't have a tension between the religious spheres and the secular spheres, the way that you ended up having at the beginning of the 20th century in a place like Egypt.
We're running out of time. I want to ask you, though, specifically on the women's issues. We also saw a demonstration earlier this month in Tunis, 2 days after International Women's Day, for inheritance rights of women. Tunisia's already progressive on inheritance rights, but the president is trying to modernize the country more and update that law more. One woman I think I read, she said she believes Tunisia can remain devoutly Muslim and at the same time modern in the way it treats women and their inheritance. Do you believe those are compatible?
I do believe that. So my late colleague Al Stepan coined the term twin toleration when talking about the coexistence of religion and modernity in Tunisia, meaning that the state tolerated religion, and the religious tolerated the state, and there is a coexistence between secularism and religiosity in Tunisia. In Tunisia, religion is a private affair.
You don't fear extremists? You don't. There were more. You know this. The UN estimates more young jihadist fighters went to Syria and Iraq from Tunisia than any other country.
Don't forget that under Ben Ali, you had tens of thousands of Islamists who had been imprisoned, and some of them lived in exile. In 2011, the floodgates were open, and it was a free-for-all democracy. So you had tens of thousands of Islamists who became militant during the time that they were in prison and became recruited while they were in prison. And many of them also found the conditions in Tunisia not conducive to their thinking. Plus, you had a period when travel was very easy for those jihadists. The porous borders with Libya did not help. And the fact that the mosque was not regulated between 2011 and 2013.
Final thing, very briefly. The Prime Minister said, I believe, maybe it was back in January earlier, he thinks that 2018 will prove to be the last very difficult year for Tunisians. Do you agree with that?
I mean, let's hope so. I don't agree with that, because I think, as I said, these are old problems. These are deeply rooted problems. These are problems that require a different way of thinking about things. They require a different approach. The same old IMF, International Monetary Fund approach that failed in the 1980s is not going to succeed now. Let's not forget, the IMF and the World Bank in the 1990s declared Tunisia an economic miracle because it was boasting 5% GDP growth every year. Yes, average between the interior of the country and the coastal area. The beneficiaries were all on the coast.
We're going to have to end it there, Safwan Masri. We could talk for hours about Tunisia, but listen, basically an optimist, and I draw from this the basic elements, the civil society, the education, the religious tolerance, all of that is going to help Tunisia going ahead.
And women.
And women as well,
rights.
Women's rights.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for watching the interview here on France 24. News coming up next.
You might watch France 24 in English, but don't forget, France 24 is also broadcast in French, Arabic, and Spanish.
Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos a las noticias de France 24.
Available on cable and satellite systems and online media in France and around the world.